Okay, we're going to get started back. We got a little bit of ground to cover before we finish. Okay, now, as we were talking about these amends, these amends says, make a list. And the list that we make is the ones that we make when we do step 4. Because the amends come off the list of step 4. And it says, make direct amends. Now there's 2 types of direct amends. There's a direct amends face-to-face, when you harm someone face-to-face. And then there's a direct amends in direct proportion to what you owe. And then the other part says, except when to do so would injure them or others. Didn't say anything about injuring you, it says them or others. Very explicit. And what that means is, you wouldn't make amends to a person at the risk of saving your own skin and hurting them. In other words, you wouldn't tell your brother you've slept with his wife, you wouldn't tell your sister you've slept with her husband. That will cause more harm. Those are the type of amends that you just have to live with until situations change. Another amends that says wherever possible. Not when, where. If a person passes away and you owe them amends, then that's not wherever possible. So the amends that we make is a direct face-to-face. That means if I have character assassinated someone, I go to that person, I'm sorry. Now you can use discreetness when you're making amends. You don't want to be too specific and graphic because you don't want to cause more harm. You wouldn't want to come to a person and say that I call you a SOB. But you can say that I'm sorry of the attitude that I've taken toward you and some of the derogatory things that I've said. You don't want to be too specific and graphic. You know what you've said, and you know your intent and motive. But some people will say, well, yeah, I was just being truthful and honest. But no, you want to use discreetness and you want to use some type of wisdom when you're making amends to people when you've harmed them. But the main thing is be willing to make the amends. Because sometimes when we're making the amends, we have to use discretion. And the only reason we're using discretion is because we don't want to cause any more harm than we have done before. The key thing is being willing. There will be some amends that you will not be able to make or fully right. But the key is that you're willing to do it if you could. That's the key. Willingness is the key. So when we talk about making these amends, and we're talking about the processes as going through, and when we get over here, the ones that we said we would never make, we will find out that if we got the momentum and the results from making the ones appear to be simple, and we find out that we end up making that amend. One thing I want to address before we move on. This step is very specific, very clear-cut about these amends that we got to make. And when we're talking about page 79 in your book, and we're going to start at the bottom of page 78 because I want to get the continuity of thought. The last paragraph. Perhaps we have committed a criminal offense which might land us in jail if it were known to the authorities. Now, what he's doing is just stating some instances, some examples. Perhaps we've committed a criminal offense which might land us in jail if it were known to the authorities. We may be short in our accounts and unable to make good. These are just statements he's making. We have already admitted this in confidence to another person, but we are sure we would be in prison or lose our job if it was known. Then he moves to another one. He says, maybe it's only a petty offense, such as padding expense account. Then the next thing he says, most of us have done that sort of thing. Then he uses another one. Maybe we're divorced and have remarried and haven't kept up the alimony. And this day and age is probably child support. To number one. That's another kind. And then he goes on and says she's indignant about it and has a warrant for our arrest. Says that's a common form of trouble too. But now he's going to include everything and anything that you have to make amends about. And he says, although these reparations take innumerable forms, and innumerable means just what it means. You can't number them. So everything that you've ever going to do or ever did comes under what he's going to talk about now. He's going to lump them all together. He says, although they may take innumerable forms, there are some general principles which we find guiding. These are the principles that we find guiding when you're making all amends. Reminding ourselves that we have decided to go to any lengths to find a spiritual experience, we ask that we be given the strength and direction to do the right thing, no matter what the personal consequences may be. People say, well, I might go to jail. Well, so be it. You did the crime, you got to be willing to do the time. Next thing it says, and he's going to come back and intimate and emphasize that pretty strongly. It says we may lose our position, our reputation, or face jail, but we're willing. We have to be. We must not shrink at anything. So people ask me, well, what about this and this? Well, the book is pretty specific about that. You have to be willing to face it. Because, remember, we made the decision in step 3 to place ourselves unreservedly under the care and the direction of a higher power. And we have to be willing to follow the dictates of that higher power. If his will that we experience consequences, we must accept that, because one thing is for certain, that he will not forsake us. He'll give us the strength to go through whatever it is that he'll have us to do. Somebody might say, well, I don't want to. Well, you've got the results of going back out and drinking if you don't. One of the most important events about shrinking on making these amends was Dr. Bob. Bill Wilson took Dr. Bob through the program, and when it got to the amends, Dr. Bob said, I can't do that. He says, I'm a physician in this community, and I have position and standing, and I don't want to do those amends. So a medical convention came up in Jersey. He went to it every year. Every year he got drunk. And Ann Smith did not want him to go. Bill says, I'll let him go. He's got to test his newfound sobriety. Dr. Bob went to the medical convention. Dr. Bob got drunk. And when they found him, the very next morning, he had a surgery to perform. Because, see, he was a proctologist, a hiney doctor. Matter of fact, it was a common term that when they said, if Dr. Bob operate on you, you can bet your ass on it. Seriously. So Dr. Bob come home drunk. Bill Wilson gave him a couple of bottles of beer that morning. He was the only doctor that could do this surgery, so Bill had to sober him up and get him steady enough where he could do this surgery. And he gave him a couple of bottles of beer and took him to the hospital, and he was settled enough to do the surgery. And that evening, Bill drove up to the hospital to pick him up, but no Dr. Bob. So he went back home to Ann Smith and told Ann. 3 hours later, there come Dr. Bob in the house, singing and happy and jovial. And what had happened is after the surgery, it is said that Dr. Bob says, yes, I must do this thing. And when he left the hospital, he went up and down the street of town making all of his amends. He never took another drink since. So the amends process is something that you cannot get around. The part which comes from, except when to do so would injure them or others. When they were in the Oxford group in Akron, there was a gent in there. Matter of fact, this gent was really the third gent that they worked on. This guy's name was Eddie R. But Bill Dotson was really the third successful person, but Eddie R. was really the third person that they worked with. And they were in the Oxford group meetings, and Eddie R. was making his confession. And his wife was there with him, because, see, you had your wives and everything in the meetings when you were making your confessions. And Eddie R. made his confession, and in the process, his wife was also moved, and she made her confession, and he literally got up and popped her in the eye. So that's where they got the part, except when to do so. Seriously, out of experience. You do not relieve yourself at the expense of another person. If you read a little bit more about this chap, Eddie R. He was a manic depressant, and seemed like that every time they sobered him up, he'd go off into a manic break. And one of the times is he had chased Ann Smith around the house with a butcher knife. And Dr. Bob used to say that also, that he thought it was a sauerkraut that did it, because Dr. Bob had this mixture that he would give drunks to try to help sober him up. And he thought it was a sauerkraut. Every time he sobered Eddie up, he'd go off on a manic break. But he didn't know at the time that the alcohol kept the manic break down. Another little bit of history. The way that it come through our program that it was not a great idea. Remember, experience, strength, and hope. For men to sponsor women and women to sponsor men, Dr. Bob caught a couple of the people that they were working on top of his desk having sex. Dr. Bob was one of the ones that really didn't want women in Alcoholics Anonymous. He wanted the women, Ann Smith and Henrietta, to work with the women, and the men to work with the men. Because back then they had the same problems that we have today. We call it 13-stepping. So these are problems that are old. And if you read some of the books, AA Comes of Age, Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers will pass on you to read some of this history, and you will see, and it'll give you a different insight why some of the old timers today tell you what it is that they, and some people say, well, it's not in the book. Well, there's so much stuff, they couldn't really put a bunch of stuff in the book. But there's so much history about how we came about and why people direct you and do certain things, then you can understand why it is that they give you direction. So the wherever possible came from there, and the making amends came from Dr. Bob. That's just a little bit of how important how these steps came about, because it came out of their experience in dealing with these problems in the early time. So we're talking about making amends. It says that we must not shrink at anything. So when we look at this processes again, about the 3 dimensions of life and the amends process, we can see that it's very much important so that is the complete and success consummation of how we're going to do this. You see, there are no new steps after steps 8 and 9. And when you read here, we're talking about, let's go to page 25 first. And that is where it says, the great fact, this paragraph, the great fact is just this and nothing less, that we have had deep and effective spiritual experiences which have revolutionized our whole attitude toward life, our fellows, and towards God's universe. The central fact of our lives today is the absolute certainty that our Creator has entered our hearts and our lives in a way which is indeed miraculous. That's the central fact. That's this. The center, the central fact, that you have made a decision to allow a power to direct your life. And then it says, He has commissioned to accomplish those things for us which we could never do by ourselves, and that is change our thinking. The essential fact of your life is that your thinking has been changed. You're living a changed life. And it says, if you're seriously alcoholic as we were, we believe there is no middle-of-the-road solution. We were in a position where life was becoming impossible, and if we had passed into the region which there is no return through human aid. I want to emphasize that because every time I emphasize this, a meeting will not change you. It's just there to support you until you make the decision to take the steps, and the steps is going to change you. The only place you're going to find an AA meeting is in the fellowship. That's why the fellowship is there, for you to find the steps. When you get to the meeting, hopefully that you will decide to work the steps. Going to an AA meeting will not change you any more than going to a PTA meeting that will make you a parent. That's what we call a parent-child meeting, where all the parents meet in school over there in America. There's some other steps that's got to be taken for you to become a parent. Now let's move back to the part where it says there's a solution. Same page. Almost none of us like the self-searching and leveling of our pride, the confession of shortcomings which the process requires for its successful consummation. But we saw that it really worked in others, and we had come to believe in the hopelessness and futility of life as we'd been living it. When therefore we were approached by those in whom the problem had been solved, there was nothing left for us to do. There was nothing left for us but to pick up the simple kit of spiritual tools laid at our feet. We have found much of heaven, and we have been rocketed into a fourth dimension of existence of which we had not even dreamed. You see, this is 1, 2, 3 dimensions, and step 10 is going to rocket you into a 4th dimension. There's no limitations on that dimension. These have boundaries. When you work a step 10 is out here. It's 10, 11, and 12. That is continuous growth. Now we're talking about spiritual growth. I surmise to you there's not a person in the room who wants to stay at the same level of salary that you are now. Everybody wants to grow materialistically in the wealth. Want a bigger house, want a bigger car. Well, how about having a bigger spiritual life? What are we doing trying to increase and expand on that? We'll go through great pains to try to make a bigger salary, get a bigger car, better clothes, better house, but how about the inner man? What are we trying to do to continue to achieve spiritual growth? This out here is unlimited. This is limited. So we're talking about being rocketed into a 4th dimension of existence that very few people, that's why I'm emphasizing very few people throughout a whole lifetime or centuries ever venture outside of this little 3-dimensional world. People live and die in these 3 dimensions. We have an opportunity to live a superior life out here in the 4th dimension. That's what I mean by that. Not be superior, but live a superior life. Not be fettered down with material and petty wants. Like a lot of people live and die, have heart attacks trying to achieve what we call the American way of life, and I'm sure you call the British way, to achieve things, get position. So we're talking about rocketing into the 4th dimension.